Thanks so much for joining me here on the Foundations of Liberty. And this is a series here on the Chris Spangle Show and Liberty Explained. So if you're not a subscriber to the Liberty Explained feed or the Chris Spangle Show feed, for that matter, if you're over in LE, but you can find these episodes individually over in the Liberty Explained feed. And that is a feed that for years we've been putting all kinds of content in that shares some of the basic foundational principles of libertarianism, like the non-aggression principle, and we answer a lot of questions. We did a series over time answering questions from listeners, and some, I think, important speeches from people like Marshall Fritz and David Bose. So you can go check that out over at Liberty Explained. There's also a Substack, Liberty Explained, where we've got a bunch of different resources that you can access over there. So you may not have listened to the introduction, but let me give you a little background on why I want to do this series and a warning, okay? I'm not a scholar. My background is talk radio. I started in talk radio in 2004, started as a Republican, became disillusioned during the Ron Paul years, became head of the Libertarian Party for 4 years from 2008 to 12, started this podcast in March of 2012, and have done libertarian content for a long time. Okay, so I've been around the philosophy, and I feel like libertarianism isn't getting a good shake right now because so many think tanks and podcasters are chasing clicks and views on TikTok and other places, and that is best when you give red meat using current events. We're not going to talk current events here. Maybe occasionally as an example, but we're going to just drill down back into the philosophy and the basics of libertarianism. I would say after 20 years, I am not necessarily struggling with the principles, but maybe some of the application. And we'll see, maybe along the way. The point of this really is for me to be thinking about these things and talking about them with you and then hearing your feedback. So I want to hear your feedback, chris@chrisspangle.com. If you've got notes, corrections, comments, I'll try to add some of those to future episodes, and we'll have a dialogue between you and I along the way. But you can get this on YouTube over, look for Chris Spangle. You can find these videos there, or you can find them in these two podcast feeds. And the goal here is just purely to kind of deconstruct and reconstruct libertarianism in my life, in my mind, and think about these ideas, right? Like, let me give you a concrete example. Pornography. Okay. I look at it and go, why should the state compel people? Why should they suppress people's honest choice? But I think if you look at the last 30 years, can you say that people are more free or are they addicted, and has society been harmed by the proliferation of porn? I think porn really is a great evil. Like, if you really read research into it, look at it, how it affects the individuals involved in it, it's pretty terrible in a lot of ways. And I don't know that it's good for the common good. But there's that tension, the common good and libertarianism, which is allowing individuals to have liberty and dignity without state oppression or state control interfering in their voluntary cooperative exchanges, right? So the foundational principle of libertarianism is also often called the libertarian pledge, or the non-aggression principle, which is we seek social and political goals without using force, because government ultimately is monopolized violence. It is coercion. If you try to go against the government, they will bankrupt you or put you in jail. You have no ability to argue. I mean, there's more along those lines in the Liberty Explained feed. The Marshall Fritz conversation, I think, is a great explanation. This introductory episode is not just about that, but also some of these individual little core principles that kind of make it up, the philosophy. And as I said in the episode right before this in the Chris Spangle Show feed, I am coming from a place of some knowledge and some expertise. I want your feedback, right? But I want you to take these ideas, wrestle with them, research them on your own, and don't just take me as the gospel of libertarianism. And secondly, it's basically a love letter to the philosophy that has given me so much. As I think it's not gotten a fair shake, I want to make like a statement of here's what libertarians have traditionally believed, because it has been morphed over the last decade. Here's what libertarianism is. It is a static, constant philosophy by which we judge our own beliefs and modern political contexts. And it is unchanging truth in many ways. And like the ability and right of individuals to have the right to choose their own path without government interference, I think, is the foundation of the natural rights tradition, which is the foundation of the American government, which I think both parties have wildly corrupted. So it's a bit of a statement to preserve. Here's what libertarians have traditionally believed over the last 75, 80 years. And even where I disagree with it, here's what it is. And here's where I disagree with it. And here's why I think, where it's succeeded and failed. So, and it is specifically beginning the year before America 250, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, because as that anniversary approaches, I want to think about where have we been as a country, what does it mean to be an American, and where are we headed? So that's just to kind of set all this up for you. This is really about the basics of libertarianism. The goal of this is to rediscover the power of liberty and to build a more prosperous, peaceful, and free society. I tend to think the Republicans and the Democrats have many different shared goals with a libertarian, and there are many things that both sides believe that are libertarian, and then there are things that they are wildly non-libertarian on. But I think in general, the way that I view it, and maybe this is naive of me, but I tend to think that most people in their heart want more freedom for individuals. That idea has been under attack the last few years, starting with the pandemic, for sure. But that has traditionally been one of my beliefs, that everybody really wants prosperity, they want peace, and they want to have the ability to self-actualize without other people's worldviews and realities impeding on their own. So we've talked about those building blocks of liberty, right? It is individualism, individual rights, spontaneous order, limited government, free markets, the virtue of production, the natural harmony of interest, and peace. And some of those may make no sense to you, but that's what this episode is about. We're going to, here in the next few minutes, go over each one of these and explain them. So let's start with individualism, because it is the core of libertarian thought. Libertarianism is individualism. By and large, it is the belief that each person is unique, capable, and responsible for their own life. Okay, so what about the people who aren't? You reach out to your community and engage, because here's what I'd say. Like, we are all owed liberty and dignity from the government. That does not mean that we are all on an island. So I don't want you to take individualism to mean something that it is not, because we all need community. And we have something called the threefold social order, which Rudolf Steiner talked about, which is you have the government sphere, which tries to solve problems through force. You have the business sphere, which tries to solve things through profit. And then you have civil society, which tries to use compassion to solve problems. And as the business and government sectors merge and take over every aspect, it weakens and atrophies civil society. And libertarians really believe that most things ought to be solved within the realm of civil society. That limited government creates optimal abilities to create wealth and to also serve people within your community. And so as we do more within government to solve things like homelessness or people who have severe health issues, as government takes up more resources to solve those problems more inefficiently, it atrophies civil society, where you have real relationships being formed to solve those problems, because people are compassionate towards others. So I don't want you to think that individualism is every person just like Ted Kaczynski moves to a cabin. It's quite the opposite. It is engaging with each other in real dynamic ways to solve problems together. And unlike collectivist ideologies, which prioritize groups, libertarians see society as a collection of free individuals, each with their own ambition, talents, and goals. So we reject grouping people based on ethnicity, religion, income, whatever, and then crafting policy around those. We really want to think about government policy because so much of libertarianism is about restraining the government sector and encouraging business and civil society. Collectivization of groups often leads to more government. History has shown that societies that value individual freedom, where people can think, speak, and act independently, are more prosperous and innovative. You may have seen this great image of North and South Korea, right? So North Korea is completely dark and South Korea is lit up. And that's because South Korea values individual freedom, where people can think, speak, and act independently. North Korea is a collectivist society. Another example is the American Revolution was the triumph of individual rights over monarchy, proving that people, not rulers, should determine their destinies, because people were invested in the cause versus a collective top-down army that had no passion. So why does it matter? Without individualism, society becomes ruled by the interest of the powerful rather than voluntary cooperation. When people are treated as mere members of a group rather than unique individuals, freedom disappears. And you may say, well, look, we've got a technocracy, a neo-feudalism creeping in because of these tech billionaires. They can only do that because they're able to buy off the government to use the force that government provides to solidify their position. And as you decrease the power of the government sector, you increase the power of civil society, which decreases and checks the power of rulers, right? So the power of a presidency is checked by markets. It's checked by universities. It's checked by media. It is checked by individuals in the vote. It is checked in a million different ways, which is why presidents like to attack those institutions, because it limits their ability to be autocratic. So let's move on to number 2, and that is individual rights, the protection of liberty. And libertarians believe that rights are not given by governments, they are inherent to human beings. Our next episode will be about rights, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. But natural versus legal rights. Libertarians follow John Locke's arguments that people are born with life, liberty, and property, which government must protect, not grant. And the Declaration of Independence reflects this, stating that rights are unalienable and not subject to government approval. You do not have to submit things to a government censor if you are a late-night TV show, because you have a natural right to be unimpeded by the government, and the marketplace will check you by decreasing your ad revenue and your viewership, so therefore you get canceled. So that's natural versus legal rights, or positive rights, as legal rights are sometimes called. And an example is the abolition of slavery in the civil rights movement, where fights were restored natural rights that had been denied to Black Americans, proving that governments can take away rights, but they cannot erase their existence. You cannot deny people like women and Black men and women the vote for long, because eventually they will fight for their rights, because that coercion is intolerable. So why does this matter? If rights come from government, they can be taken away. Recognizing natural rights means defending freedom against tyranny. So we don't want to empower the government to take away individual rights, because that means everything's on the table. Your right to defend yourself with firearms, your ability to, why did America have such a different experience during COVID? Why did red states versus blue states have different experiences versus COVID? Because a lack of arms in China means the government can do to them whatever they want, and an armed population in America means the government is limited. So the government cannot infringe on your right to self-defense in the face of government. Next is spontaneous order, which is society without central planning. So how does it work if you're not having elites planning how to order society? And this is, I think, one of the things that I love most about libertarianism. Is one of the most powerful libertarian insights that complex societies emerge naturally without central control. Hayek has something called the knowledge problem, where one individual person can't know everything and how to order society, because it's just impossible for one person to know things. Like, talk about current events for a living in front of 1,000 people, and you can say I have read 4 hours on this topic, and 15 people will give you information about that one single topic that you didn't know. Well, that's because everybody has these experiences and expertises in life, and we're all kind of feeling at the elephant, and collectively we realize it's an elephant. So you can't have government control things like language or trade or cultural traditions. They develop through voluntary human interaction. They're negotiated by individuals through, I want to associate with you or not. And that's how culture is ultimately created. An example, again, is language. Like, the English language was not planned by the English government. It just develops naturally over time of communication. Excuse me. I went full Joe Biden there. So Hayek describes spontaneous order, and Hayek is like a great philosopher in the early 20th century around many of these classical liberal ideas. So liberal, not meaning like progressive, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, but liberal is an older term that was adopted by FDR and the Democrats to mean more progressive. Libertarians are classical liberals like Hayek, Mises, and others who believe in these principles. Okay, so Hayek describes spontaneous order as the result, quote, the result of human action, but not of human design. And it proved that decentralized decision-making works better than top-down control. So why does this matter? Central planning disrupts natural processes, and it creates inefficiencies and shortages. This is the argument against tariffs, right? So when you implement a tariff and you raise the cost of importing goods from China, that good isn't shipped to China because the bill went from $2,000 for the shipment to $150,000. So then you put people out of business, right? You're interfering in the spontaneous order of the marketplace as a government. And when left free, people create better solutions than any government that they can plan. So let's move on to limited government, preventing tyranny. This is going to be a controversial one, okay? Libertarians believe that government is necessary, but its power must be limited to protecting freedom. I will be honest with you, I am not an anarchist. I've never been an anarchist. I don't intend to be an anarchist, and the older I get and the more experience I get with people and watching things in the news, I just don't think anarchism can happen where there is a complete and total absence of government. I don't think that libertarianism and anarchism are the same thing. I think they're two distinct things. And I believe that there has to be some monopolization of force, for instance, in things like courts, for justice to actually occur. And I think anarchism tends to trade justice for freedom, and I'm not about that life. But some would argue and say that the only true vision of libertarianism is anarchy, where there is anarcho-capitalism with free markets, or anarcho-communism, where people are communes working together. That's not going to be my definition, but there's a million different types of resources out there that talk about this idea. But I'm going with limited government, okay? And we'll debate how much government over the course of these episodes. But libertarians believe that government is necessary, but its power must be limited to protect freedom. That government power naturally expands unless restrained, and history proves that when unchecked, governments erode individual liberties. That is why it is important to have checks and balances within your government. That is why it is important to have decentralized government. So in America, we have federalism. So the federal government does one thing, and it's broken into 3 branches, and they must deal with state and local governments, and the state and local governments can check. So township government checks county government, which checks state government, which checks federal government. And so there's a bunch of different pieces where power is broken up in different places within our government to keep each one branch from, or one level of government from, getting out of control. A lot of that has been under assault for a long time, and we're seeing the fruition of that, I think, under the current administration, where we're now moving towards a parliamentary government, which is the power in control at the top gets to say what happens in government at every level. And that is not the founding. The founding is really this idea of limited government with checks and balances, and the rule of law being supreme versus the whims of a political party or movement or individual politician. So the Bill of Rights, for instance, exists to protect citizens from government, not to give the government the power to regulate our speech, but it denies them the ability to regulate our speech. So we've talked a little bit about why it matters, but just let's put a fine point on it. The smaller and more restrained the government, the less likely it is to violate personal freedom or interfere in people's lives. So let's move on to free markets. Free markets, the power of voluntary exchange. A free market is a system where people engage in trade, production, and innovation without coercion. So free markets allow entrepreneurs to solve problems, create jobs, innovate. An example is like the rise of Amazon and Apple and the smartphone, right? Good or bad, the smartphone, and look how much it has been innovating and changing over the last 15 years without government regulation. They did it through competition and consumer choice and not through government mandating. Eventually, these companies get so big that they go to the government. So OpenAI in the news today, which powers ChatGPT, is giving the federal government ChatGPT free and integrating itself into the federal government system. And that is a way for them to protect their position from the marketplace by using that monopolization of force. Government restrictions like excessive regulations and tariffs stifle economic growth and limit opportunity. Economic freedom creates prosperity, innovation, and wealth, benefiting everyone and not just the powerful. So if you look at global poverty since 1990 because of free trade, entire countries are lifted out of poverty in a fantastic way. So let's move on to number 6, the virtue of production. This one sounds like, what is that? Well, wealth is created, it is not taken. And a major economic misunderstanding is the belief that wealth is just like a fixed pie. And libertarians don't believe that. Wealth is created, it is not merely distributed. The more value people create, the more wealth there is for everyone. An example of that is the Industrial Revolution. It lifted millions out of poverty by not taking wealth, but creating new industries, jobs, opportunities, non-cultural organizations that still exist. And obviously there's good and bad to these things. There's trade-offs to that. And we'll talk about some of those trade-offs in the future. But why does this matter? When production is rewarded, prosperity increases, because property rights are a foundational principle of libertarianism. When you own it, you care for it more than if it is in the public sphere. Collectivist economies that focus on redistribution rather than production end up stagnating. So let's move on to the natural harmony of interest, cooperation over conflict. And many political ideologies assume life is a zero-sum game, that one group must win at another's expense, and libertarians don't agree with this at all, arguing that free societies create mutual benefit. An example is global trade, right? It has reduced poverty across the board and created peaceful international. Yes, there have been wars that we kind of started since World War II, but great power politics created far more wars over the last 100 years or 75 years that has been largely built on free trade. And a lot of this is under discussion, but I'm planting my flag firmly on it is good. This is the Christian idea of solidarity. It is good when other people who are in other countries or of different ethnicities or religion are freer, more prosperous, more harmonious. We're trading with them. We're voluntarily cooperating with them because that is good for their soul. That is good for our soul. government intervention in the marketplace, in foreign affairs, often creates conflict by forcing people into power struggles over control. It matters because when people are free to cooperate voluntarily, everyone wins rather than fighting for government-controlled resources. So our last big principle is peace, the true path to prosperity. And it is closely tied to economics and spontaneous order, the virtue of production, free markets. Peace is important because war expands government power. It erodes freedom and benefits only political elites. Libertarians talk often about defense contractors and how that incentivizes death and destruction. And I think we've seen that so concretely in the recent conflicts where America may not be a direct participant, but they're a participant in a very sad way in just helping destroy other countries, cultures, peoples. The war on terror, for instance, led to mass surveillance, trillions in debt, lost civil liberties. And I would argue the lie about weapons of mass destruction is really the accelerant that started the mistrust that has led to the breakdown of American political order in the last decade. The war in Iraq specifically, I think Afghanistan was a war that needed to be fought. You needed to go over and destroy training camps for Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But Saddam Hussein, while a state sponsor of terror, was not involved in the attacks. The war on terror just wrought so much cultural destruction, political destruction, economic destruction, and it allowed the government to take on more powers. I saw Jonah Goldberg, who's a conservative commentator, say today in response to something that the Homeland Security said, his response to what they said was, to everybody who said back in the day that Homeland Security was a bad idea, I apologize. Because when you allow war to give powers to one party in one government, eventually the other party will be in power, and war is the justification to do a lot of these things that erode our liberty and the dignity of people around the world. So we advocate for diplomacy and trade over military intervention as often as possible. We do believe in just war. We don't think that we're not pacifists, but libertarians are often peace first. The conclusion here is that these values aren't just theories, okay? They shape societies, economies, and individual freedoms, and they have for many, 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 many years. And these are values that you've got to continually talk about and share and think about, so that we continue to have this experiment of limited government and prosperity and freedom, because it can erode really quickly, can it? We're living through it. We're watching it. And that is not a commentary just on one presidency or one party. It is, the centralization of power in the executive branch has been a long project. And I think over the last few administrations, we've seen things happen that we never would have expected in 1985. Or 1995. So you've got to think about these ideas, share these ideas, and wrestle with them, right? As we talked about in the beginning. This is what libertarians believe. You don't have to buy into, we're not going to get into the debate of are you a libertarian if you don't agree with peace? Okay. There's the no true Scotsman fallacy where, a group devolves into arguing over who's the true holder of the ideology. I've never bought into that. I think you can call yourself a libertarian if you agree with most of these things, and you will wrestle with some of these things over time, and it's fluid and it expands. These are principles that you will see bear out scrutiny, and that the general principle of peace is better for peoples and nations. The general principle of free markets creates more prosperity than collectivism. Giving people autonomy over their lives creates more peace and voluntary cooperation and less conflict culturally than centralizing power. These are principles that as you bend towards them, you get better outcomes than if you bend towards collectivist planning. That is not to say this is a utopian vision of society. I'm a Christian. Every person within their heart is sinful. They need to be redeemed by Jesus. And every institution is created by individuals. Every politician and every political institution is created by humans. Every church is created by humans. And within that, there is fallibility. There will be suffering in this world because of the fall of man. And there is no perfect solution. Arguing over socialism versus libertarianism versus conservatism versus progressivism and what is the best way to get to perfection on earth, I think, is a flawed idea. What political ideology, though, creates less suffering and empowers more people to be prosperous and harmonious? That's what I'm after. I'm not Pollyanna who just thinks that if we do all of these things and we get to this point, then everything's going to be awesome, because that's not the case. There are trade-offs in capitalism. Private equity is gobbling up institutions and businesses and housing and making life worse for us. But does that mean that we need government ownership of housing to keep private equity out? No. So there are problems and flaws inherent in any system. And so I want to leave you with saying this is not a perfect ideology, nor am I arguing that. There is human suffering at the hands of any private, government, public institution because they're run by human beings, which is why Christians like me believe in the redemptive power of Jesus to come in. And God created earth, God redeemed the earth, and we as Christians are called to be redemptive along with it. And what political ideology empowers us with the most resources to redeem the earth, to bring about prosperity, harmony, and peace? And that's why I am a libertarian, because it's Christians first. Like, the foundation of Christian political thought is the Imago Dei, that every person is valuable, that you are loved, you are deserving of dignity, you are deserving of liberty, you are special, you are not worth less, you're not worthless, you're not property of other people, you are a valued human being. And that's why the Christian Revolution brought about the end of slavery. It brought about the end of murder without consequences. It brought about women's rights and opening up society to every ethnicity and religion. Libertarians want to preserve that, to not allow evil people to have that monopolized violence to use against others. So that is the foundation of how I view things. You may agree, you may not agree, but hopefully some things were stimulated and that you'll find this interesting and just share it. I think that would be really helpful if you found this helpful. And I'd love to get your feedback. Chris@chrisspangle.com. Send me an email, leave a comment. Love to talk to you soon. Thanks for joining us here on The Chris Spangle Show.